As Aaron said, I'm Emily Freeman. I run the Modern Operations Advocacy Group at Microsoft. Microsoft is actually the one who purchased the 50 books for this crowd, so I'm grateful for that. I think that's pretty cool. I am a developer advocate, which is just a fancy way of saying I get to talk about our tech to people like you, and I get to carry your feedback about our products and services back to the product teams so we build better products. I recently wrote a book. DevOps for Dummies was released in August. I can't believe I actually finished it. It was a slog, which I'll talk about today. I don't actually want to talk about DevOps or the details in the book. Instead, I want to focus on the process of actually writing it, rather than the fundamentals of DevOps, and you'll hear plenty of that over the next 2 days. I kind of want to set the tone for this event and how we proceed through the next few days together. I believe the creative process parallels our work as engineers. My editor would like me to inform you before I go on that you can buy DevOps for Dummies on Amazon. I think I mentioned I work for Microsoft. And I would absolutely love to hear what you think about it once you've read it. Writing a book is the hardest achievement I have ever set out to accomplish. I finished it like a marathoner at the end of a long race, crawling toward the finish line. I was empty. But finishing the book isn't actually the interesting story. Only in the journey did I learn the valuable lessons. In the tears and the toil, in the mud of my own emotions and self-doubt, did I learn the truths of struggle, resiliency, and creative work. Long ago, communities believed a person's creative contributions were the work of a muse. They believed that the gifts we treasure most from those ancient civilizations, paintings, sculptures, books, were the result of a human momentarily capturing the divine. And you don't have to believe in a God to recognize when someone has, for a moment, transcended the limitations of human brokenness and created something truly awe-inspiring. When this era of the muse passed, we discovered science. We began to understand pieces of the universe in which we inhabit. We moved away from the old godlike division of labor. We stopped recognizing the muses and the gods and the divine, and instead we started praising the art. And more importantly, we started worshiping the humans who created it. We began to believe that those artists and creators were somehow superior to the rest of us. Engineering software is creative work. Yes, we talk about algorithms and lambdas, but our work transcends science and technology. And throughout the creative process of building something from nothing, we have to strike this balance between influencing the outcome and stepping back to allow the work to declare itself and define itself. If I were to write a book on writing, it would be called Lessons Learned from Staring at Carpet Fibers, because there's a lot of rolling around on the floor in your own self-pity before you ever write a single word. Michelangelo, the man who gave us David and the Pieta, he believed every block of stone had a statue in it, and it was the job of the sculptor to uncover it. And maybe, go with me on this, maybe we are the sculptors, slowly chipping away at marble until the sculpture beneath begins to surface. Only instead of a chisel in hand, we type away at our keyboards, willing machines to do what we want. I know engineering doesn't always feel very glamorous, whether you're on the ops or the dev side, or PMs or executives. I think engineering can be extremely lonely work. And if you're anything like me, it can make you be filled with imposter syndrome and self-doubt just as quickly as it can make you feel like a god of all things machine, and you really nail it. In many ways, this industry has created a cult of personality. We worship the technologists who have the most Twitter followers or open source contributions. We look at people on stages, such as this one, as experts instead of peers. And we seek to prove ourselves worthy rather than building a community of vulnerability and acceptance. I did more than think about DevOps while writing this book. I thought about where I fit into the community and the type of environment we're building in tech. If you're new to DevOps, you'll notice we talk a lot about people, process, and tools in that order, because the tools you use are far less important than the people for whom you build products and the people with whom you work. But I want to focus on that second item in the list, process. For me, the process of writing, like software development, has a rhythm, an emotional ebb and flow. This is the Gartner hype cycle. Gartner uses it to teach companies that can afford Gartner how to approach user adoption. But I think it does a really good job of capturing the emotional rise and fall we experience as humans when taking on a new project or challenge, especially a really big one. When I was offered the book, I was elated. I haven't felt joy and anticipation like that in years. I felt like a success, like I had somehow arrived. And I found myself thinking about when I would walk into a bookstore and pull my book off the shelf and hold it, how good that would feel. That is the feeling of the peak of inflated expectations. It's your brain dumping large amounts of dopamine into your system. I imagined myself like Hemingway, typing away and clearly conveying my thoughts on DevOps, minus the Cuban views and rum, though more on rum and other booze later. I wasn't like Hemingway. It wasn't sexy, it wasn't glamorous, it was hard, it was lonely, and it was a lot of work. It felt daunting, and I felt as if I was going to be the greatest disappointment, especially to the people who had taken a chance on me as a first-time author. I really struggled. I don't want to gloss over that fact. I think too often we see the highlight reel of others, and we compare it to our own sort of behind-the-scenes footage. It's a false comparison, and it isolates us from each other. It cheats us of truth and community, something I think is central to DevOps organizations. The closer we're able to get to a shared experience, the more we begin to understand each other. The struggle that follows the peak of inflated expectations is the trough of disillusionment. This is your brain viewing opportunity as risk, as a danger to your safety. Your brain was never designed to make you your most enlightened self. The oldest part of our brains, right back here, basically thinks our jobs are to be born, survive to reproductive age, and replicate ourselves. That's it, done. Your brain views opportunities as risk, and it thinks of risk as a predator that wants to eat you. It will always opt for safety over uncertainty, even if it means you miss out on opportunities. And it's that part of your brain that you're at war with during the trough of disillusionment. It's a pretty dark time, and I spent most of my time writing in that phase. The only reason I was able to keep going, despite the intense struggle, was because I had friends and people who cared about me, some of whom were authors, who would give me pep talks when I was ready to throw in the towel and quit. They literally dragged me through the process. I tweeted this in early December when I was about 30% of the way through the book. It is alarmingly accurate. And if you really look at it and change a few words, it probably mirrors your own experience of engineering solutions to really hard problems. Step one is to hem and haw. This is your procrastination phase. It's your roll around on the floor until you feel mildly less overwhelmed phase. In this part of the trough of disillusionment, you'll think about writing, but you'll be distracted by the state of disorder in your closet or your sudden need for freshly baked cookies. I stress bake, so you can imagine how many cookies and cakes I consumed over the last 9 months. We're just not going to talk to my doctor about that. That's between you and me. Step two is to question your credentials. Imposter syndrome is so much fun. This phase is mostly listening to that little voice in your head that tells you you're not good enough, that you shouldn't even try, that someone else would be better. As you might know, tech is my second career. I don't have a CS degree. I was a writer before this, and I didn't touch tech until 5 years ago. In this phase, the incessant whisper of self-doubt left me feeling as if I wasn't qualified, wasn't good enough. And I became obsessed with what Gene Kim would think of my book. If you don't know, he has authored or co-authored nearly every book in DevOps. And I spent months thinking about what a disappointment DevOps for Dummies would be to Gene, until I finally got it through my head that he didn't really care and maybe didn't know who I was. Step 3 is to experience a bit of an existential crisis. You may or may not need a therapist or friendly bartender to get you through the self-doubt initiated by your negative self-talk. I did most of my writing at night. I work a full-time job, I travel for conferences, and I'm a single mom, which means my evenings are monopolized by my amazing and beautiful, but extremely demanding 4-year-old daughter. I'd put my daughter to sleep, and I'd sit next to her in bed, sort of hunched over my laptop in the dark. That cursor would just sit there, taunting me, blinking, 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 silently reminding me that I had written absolutely nothing. Until by some miracle, I would actually slap some words onto a page. On nights and weekends when my daughter was with her dad, I would go down to the bar beneath my apartment to write. And I was there so frequently that the bartenders started asking questions, because I would just sit there in a hood looking angry. It's true. It was there that I would have this momentary lift of productivity. Somehow being in the busy space helped. I'd feel good until I would make the mistake of reading what I had just written. Bad news. You hate it, or I did. And then, in my dismay, I would decide to draw diagrams, because if I couldn't write a good book, I was gonna make a damn good picture book. And then I'd realize Wiley wouldn't actually pay me for 250 pages of pictures. And so I would write some more, at which point I would continue drinking, and then collapse into bed, completely exhausted from the effort. After a break away from the work, I would wake up and read it, and then, wait a minute, love it? What? I'm a genius. Of course I deserve to be writing a book. That momentary feeling of elatedness would quickly be dismissed by a sense of uneasiness washing over me. And I'd return crashing to earth and feel utterly confused about how the piece of crap I wrote last night turned into great writing this morning. It's like the Rumpelstiltskin of words. The whisper of imposter syndrome would return, reminding me that someone else would think it was probably crappy and would tell me just that in big, bold red edits. Shout out to Susan, my editor. I spent months in this trough of disillusionment until I began to normalize. I realized that I was writing a book on DevOps, not the book on DevOps. And if it sucked, who really cared? Not Gene Kim. If the trough of disillusionment is that moment you jump out of a plane and begin to plummet toward Earth, the slope of enlightenment is this moment where your rate of descent steadies and you can slowly start to take in the world around you. You realize that the emotional ups and downs are just part of the process, and that the process will eventually end. At which point you reach the plateau of productivity, where you finally feel like you have some clue what you're actually doing. And you know that if you just keep writing, you'll have time to edit it into something good, at least mediocre, and maybe, just maybe, great. So after all that, who wants to write a book? Sounds so much fun, right? But seriously, if you're wondering if I'd suggest writing a book or if I'd write another one, the answer is yes. It is absolutely one of the best ways to promote yourself and create career opportunities down the road. Thanks to authority bias, we give authors way too much credit. We assume that they're experts instead of people who just toiled over the computer and read a lot and baked cookies. Obviously, they wrote a book, right? They must know what they're talking about. I grew a lot as a person and a professional while writing. The lessons I learned in that struggle and how I apply them to engineering were beyond valuable. I just want you to recognize that if you take on a project like that, it's not glamorous. It's a marathon through mud, and it is easier to quit than it is to push through the struggle. Some of the best advice I ever heard about book writing came from my colleague, Orrin Thomas, who's on his 40th book, which I think is nuts, but okay. He said that the first book is always the hardest because you don't know you can finish it. You may think you can, mild confidence, but you don't know that you can do it. And I think he's right. And I think it applies to more than just writing books, right? The first time you do anything is the hardest, which is why you need to make a plan and then probably throw it away. Creating a table of contents is the first step of writing a book. The publisher literally demands it. It's essentially the planning phase of a book, and books are still very much waterfall. There's not a lot of agile going on. Plans are great. They manage to get you headed in a particular direction, but sometimes, most times, you can't get to the destination unless you throw that original plan away, which, as you might imagine, may make your manager a little bit sweaty, a little frustrated. They don't like it when plans change. But tossing the plan isn't failure. It's adaptation. It's continuous improvement. It's a concept central to DevOps. There's this moment in creative work, and perhaps especially in writing, where the work begins to declare itself. And the image of what you want the book to be meets with what the book believes itself to be. Now that sounds a bit wacky, right? I'm anthropomorphizing a book and telling you that it will let you know what it wants to be read as. Yet that's exactly what happens. My father actually calls this part of writing catching fire. And it's where the toil of typing transforms into flow. Not the kind in value stream mapping, but the Mihai Csikszentmihalyi version of flow. A state of being completely involved in an activity for its own sake. The ego falls away, time flies. Every action, movement, and thought follows inevitably from the previous one, like playing jazz. I love that quote. If you're a developer, you've likely felt this at some point in your career. After a struggle at the start, the code sort of begins to write itself. You overcome the original challenges you faced, and you begin to know what you need to do next. A plan is a guide, not a prison. You are never locked in to a strategy you thought would work. When you're staring at a mountain, you can make assumptions about how to climb it and which paths to take. But you don't know what you need to do until you're 2 hours from base camp and a snowstorm moves in. It's then that you have to adapt to the environment you've been tossed into. Don't stick to the original plan just because it's convenient. Instead, make adjustments, iterate, pivot. But don't expect that adaptation to be smooth or comfortable. Growth is painful. It's also part of the process. I grew an incredible amount, as I said, but growth is awkward and uncomfortable. It exposes the areas in which you're not particularly impressive. And that requires candor and vulnerability. It would be so much easier to just act as if you know exactly what you're doing. And I think we feel a lot of pressure in this industry to do just that. Only the most courageous among us freely admit what we don't know and create space for those around us to teach. The entire process was a daily reminder that the more I learn, the less I know, and that ego is the enemy of learning. I joined a powerlifting team in Florida several years ago, and they had one rule. I had to leave my ego at the door. There was simply no room for pride. And no, I've never had quads like that. That woman's a beast, and I'm jealous. My little group of powerlifters pushed me more than any other group ever has. And there is nothing like a 300-pound man with no neck, it's just traps to skull, yelling at you because you didn't try hard enough. It was the epitome of tough love, and they created space and safety for that. They pushed me because they loved me, and they believed I could do it, even when I didn't believe in me. We talk a lot in DevOps about removing friction between teams, dev and ops, and allowing people to work well with each other. But a certain amount of friction, I think, is actually healthy, because that's how we grow. As long as it's in a safe environment, it's through working through the friction with our colleagues and our friends that we begin to form real trust. Don't fight procrastination. Writing a book is torturous because when you're writing, you hate writing. And when you're not writing, you feel guilty because you should be writing. I spent a lot of time procrastinating. I baked, I cleaned, I watched TV, I moaned to friends. I delayed. But in the end, I realized that procrastination is actually a really healthy part of the creative process. You're not avoiding work, mostly. You're doing work. It just doesn't feel like that. In all the time I was sort of rolling around on the floor complaining to friends, my brain was sorting out how to tackle a topic as broad and encompassing as DevOps. And eventually, all that procrastination work paid off. I think I've written a pretty good book. That said, the first draft of anything is gonna suck. How many of you have spent a week trying to solve a hard problem, created the most gnarly string of code, only to throw it out and rewrite your solution, mostly elegantly, in just a few hours? I definitely have. You can't edit nothing, but you can polish a turd. Terry Pratchett said the first draft is just telling yourself the story, and I think that's really beautiful. Though I do prefer Hemingway's take that the first draft of anything is shit. And maybe it is horrible. You'll make it better, but you have to start somewhere. Perfection is impossible. We're humans, we're flawed. There is nothing empirically perfect on the face of this earth. But I believe that if we pursue perfection, we just may achieve greatness. This is the Nike of Samothrace. She's also called the Winged Victory, or the Nike alighting a worship. Nike is the personification of victory, and this statue at the Louvre is one of my absolute favorites. I want you to look at her belly, how the cloth sweeps across her body in the wind. The sculptor made stone delicate and translucent, and that, for me, is absolutely divine. But the sculpture, as a whole, has a few problems. For one, she's missing a head. Now, that's not the sculptor's fault, right? But it is a wonderful metaphor for creative output. You have so little control over how your work is received, or if it's even remembered. The only thing we have control over is the work we put into it and the personal growth we glean from the experience. Maybe that's how we should measure ourselves and each other. The work, the input, and remind ourselves that the outcome is far less important. Which brings me to my last point. We need each other. I want to go back to step 8 for just a minute, and I'm going to be real with you right now. Drinking became part of my habit of writing. One liver was harmed in the writing of this book. When I was writing, I was drinking, and it got to the point that it got so connected that I had this mild fear that I wouldn't be able to write without a glass of wine next to me. Stephen King actually talks about this the drugs and the alcohol became such a deep-seated aspect of his writing process that he feared he would never be able to quit because he wouldn't be able to write without it. Drinking while writing, I think, was a way of quieting the fears of failure and attempting to partially enjoy a process that felt brutal and endless. For me, I think we drink and we do drugs and we have relationships with people we shouldn't. We do 1,000 other things to distract us from our own fears and anxiety. That's heavy, right? But so is the experience of just being us. We expect so much from ourselves. And I think at the core of each of us is a small child who's a little bit scared and who wants to belong. The fear and anxiety many of us carry around every day can be so oppressive that you can begin to feel like you can't even breathe. I want you to know that you're not alone. Even when you feel your loneliest, even when you feel like you have no one to call, we all struggle. And if we could create an environment in our work, an environment of creative, courageous vulnerability, we wouldn't have to be alone. We could struggle together. And it's for this reason that I want to go back to the age of the muse and that ethos, when the brilliant work of an artist was a human momentarily capturing the divine. Because if you believe you create great work that exceeds the reaches of average humans, all on your own, and then you fail, you mess up, what does that say about you? And more than that, how can we possibly form meaningful connections with each other if we see some humans as demigods? Community, trust, requires each of us to view ourselves as equals. We must stop putting people on pedestals, for them and for us. We must be a community in which everyone respects and admires the different contributions of each individual. As you go about the next 2 days at this conference, you'll have the opportunity to meet dozens of people who do just what you do. And later this afternoon, we'll have open spaces, which Aaron mentioned at the start. It's sort of a choose-your-own-adventure way of breaking out into small groups and talking about the issues most important to you. In these groups and other conversations, I challenge you to be vulnerable with your peers, to share your successes and your failures freely and courageously. Being vulnerable is one of the most courageous acts anyone could take. If someone is brave enough to be real with you, to be their fully authentic self, meet them where they're at, accept them, and return that gift of vulnerability. And maybe, just maybe, we can go back to our places of work and share that it's not tech at the heart of DevOps. It's humans. It's you. Thank you so much for having me.